If you're struggling badly in your life right now and you've got things going on, you might have anxiety, depression, circumstances aren't great. I have a message that is really going to impact you and encourage you. I don't know exactly where you're at in your life and I can't fix everything for you, but I want to give you some hope to hold on to. And if you can grasp this, it will completely change the way that you see things. You might have 100 questions that you've been asking God as you cry out in your desperation, and that's okay. God knows what's going on. He just wants us to get real with Him. But we must also recognize that in this life, there is nothing to be unexpected at all about even the most intense of suffering. This fallen world is not our home, but we cannot escape the consequences of living in it. You might have 100 questions for God right now, and that's okay, but just know this, that every moment He is asking one question of you, and that is, do you trust me? The Bible talks about the valley of deep darkness. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. God doesn't promise that He will always take you out of the valley or that He will even always take you around the valley. There are times when you have to go through the valley. But no matter how deep, no matter how dark your valley might be, notice two things about this verse. First of all, we don't need to fear, because this valley is the valley of the shadow of death, not of death itself, because death was defeated on the cross. All that the enemy can do is cast shadows to try to discourage you, to try to scare you, but he cannot touch you, he cannot harm you, and he cannot stop God's purposes for your life. Also notice about this verse that God is with us in the valley. We know naturally that wherever there is a shadow, there must be light, and God is the light, and He shines His light in the deepest, darkest valley. Not only do we often have to travel through the valley, but often we have to actually remain in the valley far longer than we ever expected. I know that with my own chronic illness, I never expected to be going through this still all these years later. Notice how the Bible talks about walking through the valley, because often we can't run through the valley, or we can't jog through the valley to get to the other side quicker. We have to walk through the valley one step at a time, one day, 1 hour, one moment. But I know that for many of you, even one step seems like too much right now, because you've been going through the valley for a long time and all that you see is darkness in front of you, and you're exhausted and you're overwhelmed and you just feel like you can't go on for even one more moment. I've experienced this many times in my own personal journey, and there's something that really helps me when I go through this, and I believe that it will help you too, and that is that your purpose is greater than your pain. There are often times where God will lead us into the valley so that He can show us His light. His purpose isn't always that things would go the way we want them to go, but rather that He would go with us every way that we go. And there are often times things that He can only show us and reveal to us in the valley that He can show us nowhere else. And it's often that only once we get to the end of ourselves that we can begin to start to come to a true knowledge of God. And the question that we should be asking in the valley is not, why am I going through this, or how can I be free from this, but rather, how do I best journey through this with God by my side? Suffering is like a megaphone that God uses to get our attention, to pry us away from the distractions of this life and bring us face to face with Him and His purposes for us, which is to know Him more, to become like Jesus, and to live for the extension of His kingdom. I love the story of the 3 men in the book of Daniel who refused to bow the knee to Nebuchadnezzar, and they're thrown into the fiery furnace. I once heard a preacher say that I would rather be in the fire and the 4th one show up than not be in the fire at all. And of course, the 4th one is Jesus. And oftentimes when we're in the fire and we come face to face with God, He reveals Himself to us in a new way. And as we see Him clearer, our entire perspective changes. And our circumstances, although we don't like them, they no longer become a roadblock to the perfect life that we want, but rather they become an opportunity to be refined in the hand of God into an instrument most effective for His kingdom, and to be made as much like Jesus as we can, with all the impurities burnt away. Have you ever thought about how a sword is made? It's thrust into the fire, it's taken out, plunged into liquid, put back into the fire, beaten with a hammer, and then sharpened, all so that it can be fit for a purpose. Without that, it would just be a piece of metal that serves no purpose. And in the same way, God will put us through this process at times so that He can mold us and shape us into the person that He wants us to be, and so that He can use us in ways that we never imagined. Suffering for the Christian is not meaningless. For the non-Christian, ultimately it's meaningless, but for the Christian, it's not. I love the verses in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 to 18, where Paul says, this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And you might hear that and think, Paul, speak for yourself. My suffering, my affliction isn't light. I can't even go on another moment. But that's not what Paul was saying. Earlier in the book, he actually says that he was burdened beyond his ability to cope. He despaired even of life. And the Greek word for burden is weighed down, which means heavy, which is the opposite of light. Paul isn't saying that our suffering is light. It's only light in comparison to the glory that is to be revealed. Not to minimize the suffering, but to highlight how great that glory is. And we have that hope to look forward to. We have this one life, this one opportunity to live for God, to live for eternity, knowing that we have that certain hope in the end. And that's something that we can hang on to so that we can keep going and going and going. I know that you may not feel like pressing on right now. You may feel like you've been running a marathon, you're exhausted, and there's no end in sight. But all that God is saying is to take the next step. And that might mean just coming before Him and saying, God, help me. I don't know what to do. I need you. It might be crying with tears in your eyes. It might be shouting. It might just be letting out every emotion that's inside of you. But I can promise you that if you do this and you get real with God with genuine faith and you seek Him, as you release that faith, His grace will come in and it will make your victory a reality. He will give you a greater revelation of who He is. His grace will come in and strengthen you, and this will sustain you and give you the perspective that you need to keep pressing on through the valley, and you will get to the other side stronger, far stronger than when you first entered in. Sometimes God has to tear us down in our own strength so that He can build us up in His strength and power. Think about the response that God gave to Paul when he cried out, he pleaded 3 times that his thorn in the flesh would leave him. This is what God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Suffering in this life is never easy, but it is all about purpose and it is all about perspective. And no matter what we're going through, we have this opportunity here on earth that we will never have again, to live as faithfully as we can for God and to allow Him to work His purposes in us, no matter what we're going through. When we get to the end of our life, if it were possible to have regrets, it wouldn't be that we had had easier circumstances or that things had been better for us the way that we'd wanted. It would be rather that we had lived a more faithful life. I know that this life is hard and you might be suffering greatly, but God never promised that this life would be easy. But He does promise that great will be the reward of the one who perseveres to the end. And let this be the thing that motivates you and encourages you, knowing that your purpose is greater than your pain. And friends, if you want to hear more biblical, gospel-centered messages about how to live this life for God, please consider subscribing to this channel, and I look forward to ministering to you with messages that are going to encourage, inspire, challenge, and convict. God bless you, friends.